Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. God bless you. And thanks for being with me for today's episode. And if you were with me last week, you know that I began a new little series here that I've entitled Tony's Listening and Validation Pledge to Sherry. And the way this came about is that my wife and I are presently in counseling together. We're kind of processing some things, working on some things together that we need to work on in the context of our relationship. And my wife said to me, one of her complaints toward me has been that she feels that I could listen to her better and that I could validate her better. So I'm trying to understand, what does that mean, to listen better and to validate? So I did some research and I thought about it, I prayed about it, I Googled YouTube videos on validation, I read articles, and as a result of that, I wrote a pledge that I put together for my wife. I entitled it Tony's Listening and Validation Pledge to Sherry. It consists of 23 different vignettes or 23 different points in the overall pledge. And let me just say this, that if I had to choose a proof text for this concept of what we're talking about here, I would choose Philippians chapter 2, verse 3 and verse 4, which says this: "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit." Let me make a comment there. It's interesting. He says, don't do anything out of, and then he names 2 points. Don't do anything out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Selfishness and vanity. In other words, at the epicenter of these ideas is the concept of me, right? I'm being selfish and I'm being vain. So it's me, 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 me. What I think, what I want, what I feel, what I see, what I prefer, the way I think we should do it, the way I think it should be. Okay? So he says, don't do that. Don't put yourself at the epicenter of the situation. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourself. Each of you should look not only on your own interest, but also on the interest of others. So it feels like he's kind of saying here, dude, realize that you're not the only one involved in this situation. You're not the only one involved in this relationship. There happens to be 2 of you, and therefore don't operate out of selfishness and vanity, but in humility consider the other person better than yourself, esteem them higher than yourself, and look not only after your own interest, but also to the interest of the other. And that's what I'm attempting to do with Tony's Listening and Validation Pledge to Sherry. I'm pledging to my wife that I want to try to listen to her better. I want to validate her. I want to make room for her within the context of our relationship, because that's an incredibly important thing to do. And I wanted to share one other idea just to remind you. I talked about this last week, but in the same way that a coin has 2 sides, heads and tails, I think it's incredibly important for us to remember and to realize that there are 2 very important sides in every relationship. One side is the sexual side, the other side is the relationship itself. And as we talked about last week, sex always happens within the context of a relationship. Or at least I would say that if we're going to do sex God's way, if we're going to try to honor God with the expression of our sexual gift, bring our sexual gift under the authority of God, and to practice and experience our sexual gift the way that God intends, then God always intends for it to occur within the context of a relationship. And therefore, it's incredibly important that we cultivate the relationship. We work on the relationship. We take care of the relationship. We invest in the relationship. And as we discussed last week, the healthier the relationship is, the better the relationship is, chances are the better the sex will be. And since the topic of this particular podcast happens to revolve around the concept of sexuality, it's called the Power of Purity podcast. And therefore, we talk a lot about the issue of sex. But we have to remember that sex doesn't stand by itself. Sex, if it's done God's way and if it's healthy, will always occur in the context of a relationship. And therefore, we need to work on the relationship itself. We need to pursue the relationship, cultivate the relationship, help the relationship be stronger and healthier. And then the sexual aspect of that relationship has the opportunity to be stronger and healthier. So I just think it's really important that we acknowledge that and we talk about both sides of the coin. We talk about sex. What does it mean to be healthier sexually? How do we honor God with our sexual gift? All these things are incredibly important, but just as important is the concept of the relationship itself. And because of this idea, in the context of our Thursday night group, we talk about relationship a lot. As men, we're seeking to cultivate and to make our relationship with our wife better because we understand that's the way God wants it to be. And if we're interested in having a healthy, successful, vibrant, satisfying, fulfilling sexual relationship, then we need to be willing to work on the relationship itself, which makes healthy sexuality possible. And that's what I'm after in today's episode, you guys. I thought that I would share this listening and validation pledge that I wrote to my wife, kind of as an example, just to share some ideas with you guys. What could it look like? What does it mean to pursue your wife, to move toward your wife, to try to connect with your wife on a deeper level, a more heart-to-heart level, to try to be friends with your wife, to try to cultivate this relationship. And I think that would involve listening to her and learning to validate her. And that's why I thought I would share with you guys Tony's listening and validation pledge to Sherry. So with that being said, I'm just going to go ahead and jump into the pledge itself, and I'm going to share with you these 23 aspects of the pledge. And what I'll do is just read through them one by one, and I'll comment. If I read one and I have a comment or a few thoughts to share, I will do so along the way. So here we go. This is Tony's listening and validation pledge to Sherry. And the first point is this. It should be noted that a pledge is defined as a solemn promise or undertaking. In view of this, I, Tony, make a solemn promise to my precious wife, Sherry, that I will attempt to honor and uphold the various aspects of this pledge as outlined below. Point number 2. I, Tony, understand that because of the realities of life and relationship, there will be times that we will need to talk about and discuss and communicate with one another concerning various situations that will arise in our lives and our marriage. Point number 3. I, Tony, therefore pledge to Sherry that I will always be available to listen to her, to hear her, and to validate her thoughts, her words, and her feelings to the very best of my ability. Point number 4. I, Tony, understand there may be times, based upon circumstances, that we will not be able to talk immediately and may need to schedule a time for the talk that will be conducive to both people's schedules or preference. I, Tony, therefore pledge to Sherry that I will always be available to talk with her and to listen to her as soon as is reasonably possible for both of us. Point number 5. I, Tony, understand that validation means that I allow Sherry's emotional state a space to exist. That validation is a critical communication tool, an expression of love and acceptance in our relationship. And that validation says to Sherry, I hear you, I see you, I get it, you are very important to me, I care about your feelings. Point number 6. I, Tony, pledge that I will always respect Sherry's absolute right to her own personhood, which means she always has the right to her own thoughts, feelings, viewpoints, opinions, and preferences. This means that I understand and accept that Sherry does not have to agree with me concerning any given topic or situation. And let me just say that this is an incredibly important point, you guys. The fact is that two different people each live in their own skin. They have their own thoughts, their own feelings, their own preferences, and it's very common for people to see things different, to think different, to feel different, to want different things, and therefore it's important to respect the fact that my wife is different than me, and she therefore has her own right to her own thoughts, feelings, viewpoints, opinions, and preferences, and she does not necessarily have to agree with me on any particular topic. Point number 7, I, Tony, pledge that I will try to always listen to Sherry with respect. To respect Sherry means that I will always try to maintain good eye contact. I will not interrupt her while she's speaking. I will not roll my eyes, criticize her, put her down, resort to name-calling, or any other such inappropriate or disrespectful behavior. And I think all of that pretty much goes without saying, you guys. If you want the other person to respect you and to listen to you, then I think it's incredibly important that you be willing to listen to them and to respect them. Point number 8 is this. I, Tony, pledge that I will always try to listen to Sherry with objectivity versus subjectivity. Subjectivity assumes my own personal thoughts and feelings as a priority, while objectivity assumes a priority of Sherry's thoughts and feelings above my own. I will therefore always try to set my own thoughts and feelings aside in the attempt to hear Sherry's thoughts and feelings as objectively as I possibly can. And let me just say that I think this concept of objectivity versus subjectivity is incredibly important. And we touched on this idea in last week's episode. And as we acknowledged last week, I think it's way easier said than done, because when you are personally involved in the situation, then you are subjectively involved, because your feelings are there, your thoughts are there, your desires are there, your interest is there. So you have a personal vested interest in the situation, and therefore sometimes it's very hard to be objective because you're subjectively involved. So all that I'm saying here to my wife is that when we are talking about something, when we're involved in a situation, if we're trying to figure something out, if there's a tension or a difficulty or a disagreement, that I will try to the best of my ability to take a deep breath, to take a step back, and to try to look at the situation as objectively as possible and to not just be subjective. And that brings us to point number 9, which is this. I, Tony, comprehend that there's a significant difference between listening to understand versus listening to respond, and pledge that I will always do my best to listen to understand what Sherry is sharing with me. And let me just say that that point is very personal to our situation, because in my wife's complaint toward me, one of the things she said is that she feels that I listen to respond instead of listening to understand. So in other words, when we're talking about something and she's speaking to me and she's trying to share her heart, her thoughts, her feelings, her viewpoint. She's speaking, but she feels like instead of me listening to her while she's speaking, that my head is already spinning and I'm calculating what I'm going to say, and I already know what I'm going to say, and I'm just waiting for her to pause and take a breath and finish so then I can say what I want to say. So in other words, I'm not really listening to understand her. I'm listening to respond and tell her what I think and what I feel and what I want and what I see. So I'm promising to my wife here in point number 9 that I'm going to work on listening to understand rather than listening to respond. And that brings us to point number 10, which is this. I, Tony, pledge that I will always attempt to find any areas of Sherry's thoughts, feelings, and point of view that I can agree with, and I will then attempt to communicate this agreement to Sherry. This will affirm to Sherry that I am listening to her and that there are areas of agreement between the two of us, even if there are other areas where we disagree with one another. And in this point, you guys, it makes me think of the concept or the metaphor or the old saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And in that metaphor, of course, if the baby was dirty, you would give the baby a bath, right? And at the end of the bath water would be dirty. So you want to get rid of the bath water. You're going to throw out the bath water. But you wouldn't throw the baby out with the bath water, right? The baby is of value. The baby is significant and important. So you would keep the baby and you would throw out the bath water. So the point being that we should always look for what is of value in what our spouse is trying to say to us. What is the baby in the bathwater, in other words? Here's a way to say it, guys. Let's say that you and your wife are speaking, and through the course of a conversation, she makes 10 different points to you. And in your heart and in your head, you might disagree with 9 of those 10 points that she's making. But look for the point of agreement. If you can find one thing that she's saying that has credibility and value, then you should focus on that one thing and acknowledge it to your wife. Honey, I hear you saying this, and I agree with you on this point. I think this is correct. I think you have a very legitimate point here, and it's something that I need to consider, and I just want to acknowledge that I agree with you. So that if you can acknowledge to your spouse points of agreement, then that is going to be helpful in moving forward in your discussion and your relationship. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Point number 11 is this. I, Tony, pledge that I will always attempt to understand Sherry's heart, thoughts, feelings, and point of view, even if my feelings and point of view happen to be different from hers on any given topic or situation. I will try to always be empathetic toward Sherry, which means I will attempt to at least understand her thoughts and feelings, even if I'm unable to personally share her thoughts and feelings. Which brings us to point number 12, and point number 12 is this. I, Tony, will always attempt to share my thoughts, feelings, and heart with Sherry as calmly and accurately and honestly as I can from my point of view if Sherry is interested in hearing what I have to share in response to what she is sharing with me. And I think that this is a very important point, you guys, that we recognize and acknowledge and understand that the relationship is a two-way street. And of course, I want to hear my wife's heart and voice. I want to listen to her, what she's conveying to me. But then I also would like the opportunity to share with her my thoughts, my feelings, my heart, my viewpoint as accurately as I can if she's willing to listen to me, which in my case, I would advocate that my wife is always willing to listen to me. She wants to know what I think and feel. And I think what I'm after here, you guys, is the idea that it's important for me to convey to my wife, honey, I'm willing to try to talk to you about this. I'd like to share with you my viewpoint, my thoughts, my feelings, the way that I see this, so that even if you disagree with me, at least you understand what's going on inside of me, what I think and what I feel, and why I think what I think. Even if you disagree, maybe you disagree and that's your prerogative. You can disagree with me, but at least you'll understand my reasoning and why I think and feel what I think and feel. So that's the point that I'm after here in point number 12. That brings me to point number 13, which says this: I, Tony, will always attempt to be as concise as I possibly can when I'm sharing my thoughts and viewpoint with Sherry. I will try not to say in 1,000 words what could be said in 50 words. And let me just say here again, you guys, that this point is very specific to my relationship with my wife, because it's been an issue and it's been a problem over the 37 years of our relationship. And if you have been listening to this podcast, you probably are already aware of the fact that I'm a verbal person. I have words. My thoughts and my words are always there, and I have an abundance of words, and I have a proclivity, a tendency to use too many words. I could make a point quite simply, ABC, but I go on and I make the point over and over again, 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 times in a row, which is ridiculous. It's overkill. I could say it in 50 words, but I take 1,000 words to make the point. And as I've done this over the years, I've overwhelmed my wife. In fact, very early on, when we were in the earlier years of our marriage and we were in counseling, Christian counseling, a term emerged that we called circling the wagons. And the metaphor was in the old days of the cowboys and Indians, or the prairie when civilization was moving west, right? And people had their wagon trains, but then the Indians would come to attack. So they would circle the wagons. They would put their wagons in a circle, and they would try to fight the Indians to try to survive out on the prairies of the West. So you had to circle the wagons in order to survive. And Sherry used this as a metaphor because I would descend upon her with my words, my thousands and thousands of words, and my thoughts and my reasonings and what I see and what I think and what I feel and what I want and why you're wrong and why I'm right and what about this and what about that and this and that and blah, 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 blah. All of Tony's words. And in order to survive the onslaught of Tony's words, Sherry would have to metaphorically circle the wagons and kind of hide and wait for this storm of words to be finished. So this has been a challenge in the context of our relationship. And let me just say that you know how we say and we acknowledge that in virtually every relationship, typically one person is higher sex than the other person, which means they would like sex more than their partner. Well, in much the same way, we know and understand that in many relationships, one person is more verbal than the other person. So the person that's more verbal, they have access to their words and their thoughts and their feelings, and they're able to verbalize and articulate and assemble their words and their sentences and their thoughts and their reasonings and their arguments and their explanations. They have their words. The other person sometimes doesn't have the gift of words like that. They are not able to articulate. They don't always know what they think or feel. And so it's hard for them to assemble their thoughts and their words. And it makes it much harder for them in the context of the relationship because they are nonverbal. And in my case, without a doubt, I am the verbal partner. I'm the person who has the words. And my wife is more nonverbal than me. She doesn't always have her words. She's got to try to find her words. She doesn't even always know what she thinks or feels. And she's got to try to figure out what's going on inside of her and how can she explain to me and offer to me that which she doesn't even have possession of yet. So I can't tell you how many times in the early years of our marriage, my wife would say to me, I don't know. That was her common response. I don't know. Where do you want to go eat? I don't know. What do you want to do? I don't know. What do you think about this? I don't know. What do you think about that? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. And it used to drive me crazy. And I would think to myself and sometimes say, what do you mean you don't know? You're a grown woman. I'm asking you right now on this particular issue, ABC, what do you think about this? I don't know. She didn't have the words. So I literally learned in the early years of our marriage that I had to respect this about my wife and I had to make room for her and I had to give her time. So sometimes I might say, babe, I feel like we need to talk about this particular issue, XYZ. So can you kind of think about XYZ and process it? And then on Thursday, 3 days from now, we'll try to talk about it because it takes her that long to try to find her words and her thoughts and figure out what she thinks about XYZ. So when I say this in point number 13 of the pledge, I, Tony, will always attempt to be as concise as I possibly can be when I'm sharing my thoughts and viewpoint with Sherry. I will try not to say in 1,000 words what could be said in 50 words. So over the years, as Sherry and I have attempted to be healthier in our relationship, what it's meant is that I need to bring my words down and Sherry needs to bring her words up. So both of us have been stretched in order for us to be healthier. I got to work on being more concise, on using less words so that I don't force my wife to circle the wagons. But Sherry's work then is to be more articulate, to find her words and to be willing to share her thoughts and words with me. So I've got to come down and she's got to come up, and we probably will never be even with each other. I will always be inclined to be more articulate than my wife, but at least we can move toward one another and try to be closer together in the way we communicate. And that has been a challenge for us, and that's something that we have been working on for about 37 years now, and something I'm pretty sure that we'll continue to work on until the day that one of us finally dies and goes to heaven. But I guess I wanted to include this point 13 in my pledge. It feels important because if it's Tony's listening and validation pledge to Sherry, then part of my listening and validation is that I can't bury her with my words. I need to back off, and I need to learn to be more concise in my communications, and I need to make room for my wife. And with that being said, you guys, I see from the clock that I'm basically out of time for today's episode, so I think I'm going to wrap it up here. I shared with you that there are 23 points to this pledge that I wrote to my wife, and I have now shared the first 13 with you. And that means that we're basically just over halfway. So if you're able to come back and join me next week for the next episode of the Power of Purity podcast, I will continue to share Tony's listening and validation pledge to Sherry, and we will continue with point number 14. in the meantime, you guys, thanks for being here today. I pray that this is encouraging to you, that it maybe gives you some ideas and thoughts on how to move toward your wife, how to engage your wife, how to maybe listen better to your wife, how to work on validating your wife, how to make room for your wife's subjective reality. And I pray that it might be a blessing and an encouragement. So be blessed, you guys. Have a great day. Have a great week. Be strong with God and exercise your no muscle. I encourage you to continue to be a man of purity as you seek to bring your sexual gift under the authority of Christ. God bless you, and I'll see you right back here next week. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.